Crying at a wedding, crying during a sad movie, crying from pure relief when something finally works out after a long stretch of stress. Every human on Earth does this at some point in some form, and it turns out no other primate does anything close to it. Not one. And the explanation for why humans specifically evolved to cry from emotion alone is stranger than you'd expect. Human eyes actually produce 3 distinct types of tears, and only one of them is unusual. Basal tears constantly, quietly lubricate the eye and exist in essentially every land animal with eyes. Reflex tears flush out irritants like smoke or dust, and those exist widely across the animal kingdom too. Emotional tears, the kind triggered purely by feelings rather than any physical irritant at all, are the genuinely unusual category, and they're the specific focus of this video. As far as researchers have been able to determine using the tools currently available, humans are the only species that reliably produces tears specifically in response to emotional states, sadness, grief, overwhelming joy, or relief, with no physical irritant involved whatsoever in the process. Other primates display plenty of distress behavior, vocal calls, facial expressions, body language, but nothing that matches actual tear production tied directly to an internal emotional state rather than something physically affecting the eye itself. One influential explanation, developed by researcher Orrin Hassan, treats emotional crying as what evolutionary biologists call an honest signal, a costly display that's difficult to fake convincingly, which makes it more trustworthy to everyone observing it happen. Because producing genuine tears isn't something most people can simply perform on command with full realism, visible crying reliably signals real internal distress to others nearby, which can reduce aggression, invite comfort, or communicate sincerity in a way that words alone often can't quite manage on their own, no matter how carefully chosen those words might be. Part of what makes this signal costly, and therefore credible, is a very literal physical cost. Tears blur your vision. In a genuinely dangerous ancestral environment, temporarily impaired eyesight during a moment of visible distress represents a real, tangible vulnerability, not just a symbolic one. Under this theory, crying works partly because it can't be faked cheaply. You're visibly handing over a small piece of your own alertness and safety in that exact moment, which is precisely what makes the signal so hard to dismiss as insincere. Researcher Robert Proven and colleagues tested this signal directly in 2009, showing participants identical photographs of people's faces, except some images had the visible tears digitally removed, leaving everything else about the expression exactly the same. Participants consistently rated the photos with visible tears as sadder and as more in need of support and comfort compared to the exact same face with the tears erased. The tears themselves, not just the surrounding facial expression, were doing real, measurable communicative work, changing how strangers interpreted and responded to an identical face. Research led by biochemist William Frey found something else genuinely strange. Emotional tears aren't chemically identical to basal or reflex tears. Emotional tears contain measurably different concentrations of certain proteins and stress-related hormones compared to tears produced simply from cutting an onion. That chemical difference suggests crying from emotion might serve some additional physiological function beyond communication alone, possibly helping regulate stress hormones in the body during an intense emotional moment, though the exact mechanism involved still isn't fully settled science. Frey's research also tracked how frequently people cry emotional tears and found real variation worth noting. Average reported crying frequency differs measurably between individuals and across demographic groups, shaped by a genuine mix of biological factors, like hormone levels, and cultural factors, like which emotional displays a given society openly encourages or actively discourages. That variation doesn't undermine the underlying signal itself. It suggests the baseline capacity for emotional tears is likely universal across humans, while how often and how openly that capacity actually gets expressed depends heavily on individual and cultural context layered on top of it. Crying also appears deeply tied to attachment and caregiving behavior specifically. Infant crying reliably triggers a caregiver's attention and response almost universally across cultures, and many researchers argue adult emotional tears likely evolved from that same underlying attachment system, repurposed and refined for adult social bonding rather than pure infant survival. Seen this way, an adult crying in front of someone they trust isn't a completely separate behavior from an infant crying for its parent. It's arguably the same ancient system, still doing largely the same underlying job. Chimpanzees and other primates express clear distress through loud vocal calls, exaggerated facial expressions, and specific body postures, all genuinely effective at communicating internal states to other group members nearby without needing anything resembling human speech. What they don't reliably show is actual tear production tied specifically to those emotional states, even during moments of visible, intense distress that would trigger crying in almost any human witnessing the exact same situation. It's worth being careful here, since testing this precisely across species is genuinely difficult, and some researchers caution that absence of clear evidence isn't necessarily the same as definitive proof it never happens under any circumstance whatsoever, in any species, anywhere. It's worth being honest that this remains a genuinely unsettled area of research overall, despite how compelling the honest signal explanation might sound at first. Some scientists argue emotional crying might simply be a biological byproduct of humans having an unusually complex nervous system, rather than a trait specifically selected for its own social communication value in the first place. Cross-species comparisons are notoriously difficult to run cleanly, and much of the evidence here is necessarily indirect rather than fully conclusive either way, since you can't exactly ask a chimpanzee what it's feeling in a given moment. None of this uncertainty means crying is somehow less real, less valid, or less worth taking seriously as a genuine, meaningful human signal, regardless of which specific evolutionary explanation eventually turns out to be correct. Understood this way, crying isn't really a loss of control at all, even though it can feel that way in the moment it happens, catching you off guard in front of people you didn't plan on showing that much to. It might be one of the oldest, most literal forms of honesty your body is capable of producing, a signal so costly and so difficult to fake that evolution apparently decided it was worth keeping around for hundreds of thousands of years despite the real vulnerability it creates. The next time tears show up somewhere you didn't expect them, it might be worth remembering that reaction has a much longer, much stranger story behind it than simple embarrassment ever gives it credit for. Something as small and involuntary as a tear turns out to be carrying an entire evolutionary argument about trust, vulnerability, and connection inside it, one that took hundreds of thousands of years to write. That's exactly the kind of hidden thread this channel exists to dig up. If you want more of these, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.